This is a survivor's tale. It's a story of a little boy and his mum and dad who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And worst of all, they happened to belong to the wrong ethnic minority. They were Jewish. I was born in Novi Sad, Yugoslavia. It's now Serbia. A city of 80,000 inhabitants, 10% of whom were Jewish. I came across a family tombstone in the local cemetery dated 1805. So my family weren't exactly Johnny-come-latelys. They'd been in the area living peacefully in the community for over 2 centuries. My father had a shop in the high street selling electrical goods. My mother was a housewife. And we lived in the city centre. Now, when Britain declared war on Germany, September 1939, Yugoslavia decided to stay neutral, and they remained neutral for the next 18 months. Now, this changed in April 1941, when the country was invaded on 3 sides, by Germany, by Italy, and by Hungary. Novi Sad came under the control of the Hungarians. Now, the Hungarians did not impose restrictions on the Jews, except for the fact they had to wear a yellow star, and they did send some Jews to the camps in the east to work in the labor factories. But crucially, they did not send Jews to the death camps of Auschwitz and Treblinka. This changed in March 1944. Germany was losing the war. Hungary tried to change sides. They put out feelers with the British and the American allies. German intelligence somehow found out. Germany decided to invade Hungary. Novi Sad came under German control. Within a very short space of time, the transports to the east, to Auschwitz, started. Within 56 days, 437,000 Jews were transported from Hungary and Yugoslavia to death camps of Auschwitz and Treblinka. Now, this number compares with the same number of people that were injured or killed in the whole of the British Empire throughout the Second World War. My parents, with their Jewish friends, were ordered to go to the local assembly point. They were told they're being taken to somewhere in the east to help in German factories with the war effort. They had no idea of the nightmare fate awaiting them in the death camps. Now, my father was only half Jewish. His father was Jewish, his mother was not. At the time, he was exempt from the transports. But he decided to go with my mother. Now, looking back on it now, as their child, do I think that I was abandoned because my father decided to go with my mother? No, I don't think so, because they thought I'd be safe. Before they went to the assembly point in Novi Sad, they took me to one of my father's sisters called Erji, who lived nearby. And they thought they'd be going to this camp in the east to work with the German factories, come back and collect me after the war. But I wasn't safe, and they never came back. Now, I spent some time with Erji. I knew her and her 2 daughters, but I couldn't understand why I was there, why my parents had left me, and when they were coming back. After some time, I was betrayed by one of the neighbors, and I never found out who the neighbors were. But who would want to betray a little boy of 5? The mind just boggles. I cannot understand the mentality. Can you? But betrayed I was. I was picked up by the Gestapo and taken to the local prison, put into a solitary cell. I was unable to see outside through iron bars. I remember vaguely crying my eyes out. I didn't know what was happening to me. The following day, I was picked up and taken to one of the transit camps which was a staging post for Auschwitz. The camp was dirty, there was little food, and what there was almost inedible. The washing facilities, the toilet facilities were minimal. There were no proper beds, no blankets to cover you at night. Now, 78 years later, I cannot understand and comprehend how I, as a child of 5, could have survived and coped with that situation. I guess some adults, maybe friends of my parents, were there to look after me. Now, when the Gestapo picked me up from my Aunt Ergi sent a telegram to her sister Etel in Vrbas, a village about 40 miles away. The telegram read, "They've taken little Ivan. What can we do? What shall we do? We have to do something." Now, Etel, who is the go-getter of the family, immediately took a train to Novi Sad on a mission to rescue me. I don't know how she managed to bribe some officials to find out what was happening to me. Now, after about 10 days or a fortnight in the transit camp, I was marched forcibly with thousands of other prisoners towards the railway station on the way to a train to Auschwitz. As I was being marched along this long road, it was alongside a large forest, to my absolute amazement, my Aunt Etta suddenly dashed out, grabbed me, pulled me to the forest with her. The whole incident probably took less than a minute, perhaps 2. I talked to a woman many years later in Vrbas in the early 60s who'd been in the same column of prisoners. And she said to me, "I saw the incident. I saw your aunt dashing out of the forest to grab you and run into the forest with you. You were very lucky. There were thousands of prisoners there, relatively few guards. And the 2 German guards that were there looked the other way. So I guess they were German conscripts and not Nazi fanatics." Now, we spent a few days in the forest hiding. I was then taken to Etel's house in Vrbas. Etel had a large house with a big courtyard at the back and a cellar, a small cellar where I was able to hide. And I was there for the next 8 months. I didn't leave the premises. I was told, if ever someone comes into the courtyard of the house and accidentally catches a glimpse of you, do not mention that you're Jewish. Well, this time I was not betrayed. Had I been betrayed, my aunt, her family, and I would have been shot. Their house would have been burnt down. Now, who can say today they would have taken that enormous risk? Huge amount of courage required. But I did survive. One of my granddaughters, Lulu, asked me some time ago, "Grandpa, did what happened to you, was that similar to what happened to Anne Frank?" And I said, "Well, I don't really like to compare myself to Anne. She was hidden for 2 years in Holland, was betrayed and died. I was only hidden for about 8 months. I wasn't betrayed, and here I am. So I can't compare myself to Anne." In October 1944, Yugoslavia was liberated by the Yugoslav partisans and by the Russians. We were free. Now, what had happened to my parents? We found out fairly quickly after the war that my mother had died in Bergen-Belsen in Germany after the British Army had liberated the camp in April 1945. When the British Army arrived in Belsen, they found 10,000 unburied bodies. They found 38,000 survivors, and 13,000 of these survivors died within a few days of the British Army arriving. Unfortunately, my mother was one of them. Now, by strange quirks of fate, the father of one of my daughters-in-law, Gabor Elman, was also in the Belsen camp and survived. By another quirk of fate, at 6 degrees of separation, My other daughter-in-law, Claire's grandfather, Reg Dark, had been with the British Army, which liberated the camp. Now, nearly 60 years later, the liberator's granddaughter married the victim's grandson, and they're here today. Now, had you said this or read this in a novel, you'd have said, oh, it's too far-fetched. Couldn't have happened. But it did happen. So we knew what had happened to my mother. What happened to my father? I didn't know for many years what had happened to my father. He just disappeared. It wasn't until 2001 when I wrote again to the Red Cross in Geneva and for more information. They said, well, we've recently received some documents from the former USSR, and they may contain some information about your father. Write to the museum in Auschwitz. I wrote to Auschwitz, and within a very short space of time, I got a reply. Your father arrived in Auschwitz in March 1944 and was transported to Buchenwald in Germany on January 26, 1945. He was on one of the last transports out of the camp. The camp was liberated the following day by the Russian army. Now they said, we don't know what happened to your father in Buchenwald, suggest you write to them. I wrote to Buchenwald and again got a reply very quickly. The reply said, look, your father arrived in Buchenwald on the January the 27th, 1945. He was so ill, he couldn't pronounce his name. He died on arrival of heart failure. But we do know who he was. We recognized him by the tattoo number on the inside of his arm. Now, when prisoners were taken to Auschwitz, they were dehumanized. One of the ways of dehumanizing you is to take away your name and give you a number which is written on the inside of your arm. So that enabled the authorities at Buchenwald to recognize who my father was, and gave me closure as far as my father's fate was concerned. And that was nearly 50 years after the event. Now, thinking back on it, it was the end of the war. The Germans were losing it. The Russians were outside the camp of Auschwitz. The Germans are still sending prisoners into Germany from Poland with passenger lists. I mean, this is bureaucracy gone mad. I just cannot understand that mentality at all. Now, before the war in 1938, my mother's sister Magda and her husband George decided to emigrate and live in London. They went not as refugees, but as economic migrants for a better life. They had no children. And after the war, they decided, when they found out that my parents had not come back from the camps, they were trying to adopt me. Now, this wasn't easy. It took over 3 years for the Yugoslavs to agree to let me go, and for the British to let me come in. Now, they could have easily sent money. That would have been the easy way out. After I had no idea what I looked like, what sort of child I was, how traumatized I might have become, having lost my parents at the age of 5 and been hidden for some months under occupation by the Germans. They had no idea what I looked like. And this was the photograph my Aunt Etta sent to London before I came here. There's me on the left-hand side with Ethel and my cousin Jovica. Now, I didn't want to come to England. I knew no one in England. I could not speak a single word of the language. My Uncle George sent his cousin Miklos to Yugoslavia to collect me. After Ethel, with a very, very heavy heart, decided to have a better life in London. I was dragged kicking and screaming to the railway station of Vrbas. My Aunt Ethel fainted with the stress. We stayed overnight in Belgrade and then travelled to London. At the airport in London, my uncle's cousin said to me, look, over there are your new parents. I just looked the other way. I didn't want new parents. I wanted my parents back. We drove about an hour to Amersham, where my aunt and uncle lived, And I went into their house, and they showed me my new bedroom. And wow, in this bedroom was a brand new bicycle just for me. Life was suddenly beginning to look up. The following day, my aunt took me with her to the high street shopping, and I couldn't believe the range of goods, especially foodstuffs, on sale in the high street. I'd come from a communist Yugoslavia where there was very little in the shops, certainly very little food, and constant blackouts. So this is a completely new world for me. I went to school almost immediately. I couldn't speak a word of English. At the time, I was the only child in the school who was a foreigner and couldn't speak English. Now, this is obviously very different from any school in the UK today. At the time, I was the only one. And I remember one incident with a teacher trying to teach me the English numbers, and she asked me to repeat after her. 1, I repeated 1, 2, repeated 2, 3, this went on for some time. And eventually children behind me started to chatter. And the teacher turned around and said, "Shut up!" And I said, "Shut up," thinking that was the next number. Now, that was obviously, the children just fell about laughing. I blanked out the first few years of my life in England because it was very difficult to adjust. After I'd come to a strange country, not knowing anybody, not knowing a word of the language. But I did eventually adapt and have happy memories of my teenage years. I went to a good school, I went to a good university, and had a satisfying career. So yes, I have been lucky. But many people, most have not been so lucky. 90% of the Jews in Yugoslavia did not survive the war. Over 90% of the Jewish children did not survive the war because children are more vulnerable. A friend of mine asked me some time ago, he said, "Ivan, with your traumatic background and childhood, how can you say you've been lucky?" Well, I have been lucky. I was embraced by my father's family in Yugoslavia, who saved my life. I was embraced by my mother's family, who adopted me in England. I was embraced by my in-laws, my family into which I married, the Tuckers, in London. So yes, I have been lucky. But most have not been so lucky. And most of all, I've been lucky. I've had a marriage that lasted nearly 60 years. I've got 3 lovely children, all of whom are here today, and 6 grandchildren, also all of whom are here today. And this picture shows the family about 8 years ago at our 50th wedding anniversary. Hitler was determined that that my family would not survive, would be eliminated and crushed. And this picture shows that he did not succeed. So that gives me great satisfaction. Now, the Holocaust didn't happen centuries ago. It happened within living memory. It happened within the memory to people like me, my family, my parents, and my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, who actually committed suicide to avoid being transported to Auschwitz. So it's very recent. It's still within living memory. Now, since Auschwitz was liberated nearly 80 years ago, we've had genocides in Darfur, in Bosnia, in Cambodia, and we've now got the abyss of the Ukraine. History is repeating itself. You don't seem to have learned anything from it. We've now seen today what extreme hatred, intolerance, and prejudice can lead to. Taking extremes, it can lead to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. It must never happen again. We must never forget. You must never forget. It must not happen again. Primo Levi, the Italian author, also a Holocaust survivor, said, "It happened, and therefore it can happen again." Thank you.